Welcome to another deep dive. I'm really glad you're with us today because the stack of sources we're navigating, primarily these major in-depth reports published in Business Standard and Mint, all dated March 3, 2026. They feel fundamentally different from a standard daily news briefing.
Yeah, they really do.
We are looking at an actual geopolitical earthquake. The sheer scale and speed of what is unfolding globally right now requires us to step back and look at the mechanics of how the world actually works when the systems we, completely take for granted are suddenly broken.
Exactly.
Today, our mission is to unpack the massive cascading effects of a sudden, violent escalation in the West Asia conflict. We're going to examine how a geopolitical shockwave instantly redraws global shipping maps, sends Indian stock markets into a severe tailspin, freezes the tea sitting in warehouses, and even reaches right into local real estate markets.
And we can't ignore the ripple effects either.
Right. We're going to look at how the rest of the world is reacting in the background. Specifically, a highly pragmatic reset in India-Canada relations, multi-billion-dollar pivots in AI infrastructure, and a fundamental rewiring of how humanity accesses space.
It's a massive slate to cover.
It is. But before we jump in, a quick but necessary note to you, our listener. The sources today cover intense, politically charged conflicts involving multiple nations, governments, and political figures. People are actively losing their lives in these regions. We are not taking any sides or endorsing any viewpoints. Our mission is strictly to impartially report and unpack the facts, the economic data, and the strategic ideas contained in these original source materials so you can understand the broader implications.
That's right. Just following the data.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So.
We have to start at the absolute epicenter of the crisis. If you look at a live map of the Middle East right now, you aren't just looking at standard trade routes or national borders.
No, you're looking at a war zone.
You're looking at a massive, interconnected region, glowing red with airspace closures and military alerts. The Middle East is experiencing a profound, rapid destabilization, and the spark for this was highly specific.
To grasp the economic and logistical fallout, we first have to dissect that geopolitical spark. The reports confirm that this immediate escalation followed joint strikes by the United States and Israel on Iran. And the critical data point here is that these strikes resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Which is, that's unprecedented.
Completely. When a figure of that magnitude, someone who has been the ultimate political and religious authority in Iran for decades, is killed, you don't just get a localized diplomatic crisis. You create an instantaneous power vacuum and trigger pre-existing, deeply entrenched retaliation protocols.
Right.
The immediate aftermath has been a massive wave of strikes by Iran and various allied armed groups, targeting not just Israel, but U.S. military assets and several Gulf nations simultaneously. This isn't a border skirmish. It is a multi-front war that ignored national boundaries overnight.
And the specific locations hit in just the last 48 hours illustrate just how wide this net has been cast.
Honestly, it defies a lot of the conventional wisdom about localized containment.
It really does.
The sources detail strikes on a British base in Cyprus, a French facility in Abu Dhabi, an Italian troop base in Kuwait, and perhaps the most critical target for the global economy, Saudi Aramco's largest oil refinery in Ras Tanura, sitting right on the Persian Gulf Coast.
That refinery hit is critical.
Yeah. We're also seeing reports of missiles over Bahrain and Qatar. The entire Gulf airspace has essentially been locked down. But there's one detail in the reporting that really highlights the sheer density and the confusion of this airspace right now. Kuwait mistakenly shot down 3 American F-15E fighter jets in what is being described as friendly fire during an incoming Iranian attack.
Just incredible.
Thankfully, all 6 crew members ejected and were recovered. But from a military operations standpoint, how does something like that even happen between allied forces? It happens because the technological reality of modern warfare often outpaces human command and control. We use the phrase fog of war as a metaphor, but in an airspace like the Gulf right now, it's a literal electronic density.
Meaning there's just too much happening on the radar.
Exactly. When you have inbound ballistic missiles, swarm drones, allied interceptors, and ground-based air defense systems all operating in the same narrow geographic corridor, the automated systems have to make split-second decisions. Military aircraft use IFF, identify friend or foe transponders, to signal to ground batteries that they are friendly.
Right.
But in a saturation attack, if there is a momentary latency in that electronic handshake, or if an automated Patriot missile battery misinterprets a radar signature amidst heavy electronic jamming, allies shoot down allies. As Bader al-Saif, an analyst from Kuwait University, noted in the sources, confusion reigned supreme. due to a lack of a clear, coordinated endgame.
And when multi-million-dollar jets are lost to friendly fire, it signals to the globe that the situation is moving far faster than military intelligence can track and manage it. That level of systemic confusion is clearly causing deep, fundamental anxiety among European allies. It isn't just a matter of releasing diplomatic statements of concern anymore. French President Emmanuel Macron's reaction was a massive shift in posture.
A huge shift.
He isn't just talking about stepping up France's defensive readiness. He explicitly announced a boost to France's nuclear arsenal. France is moving to restore its nuclear warhead count back to 1990s levels, which brings them to around 290 warheads.
Right.
And the reporting points out this is directly tied to Europe questioning the reliability of U.S. security commitments under President Donald Trump. Macron used a very specific, almost Machiavellian phrase to justify this.
Yeah, he stated, "To be free, one must be feared, and to be feared, one must be powerful." That is a jarring departure from the bureaucratic, consensus-driven language we're used to hearing from the European Union regarding defense.
It sounds like something out of a different century.
It does. But you have to look at the historical context weighing on Paris right now. For decades, Europe's ultimate security guarantee was the U.S. nuclear umbrella provided through NATO. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered the assumption that conventional land wars in Europe were a thing of the past.
Right.
Now, layer on top of that a U.S. administration that has openly questioned the transactional value of NATO, and suddenly, countries like France feel incredibly exposed. A destabilized Middle East, which sits right on Europe's doorstep and controls its energy flow, is the breaking point. Macron is essentially arguing for European strategic autonomy.
So she's saying Europe has to fend for itself.
He is stating out loud that Europe can no longer outsource its survival to Washington. And in the brutal math of geopolitics, ultimate sovereignty requires an independent, robust nuclear deterrent.
I want to pivot from the nuclear deterrence in Europe to the immediate kinetic spillover happening much closer to India. Because the shockwaves aren't just hitting Western military bases. The sources detail severe, violent fallout in Pakistan. We are looking at reports of at least 24 people dead across pro-Iran protests that specifically targeted U.S. consulates in cities like Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, and the Gilgit region.
The human toll there is escalating incredibly fast.
In Karachi alone, 10 protesters were killed when they attempted to storm the U.S. consulate. And simultaneously, Pakistan and Afghanistan are in their 5th straight day of border clashes, exchanging heavy artillery and rocket fire.
This illustrates how a geopolitical shock acts as a massive accelerant for existing regional fault lines. Pakistan is already navigating incredibly complex domestic politics, severe economic distress, and deep sectarian divides. The death of a major Shia leader, like Ayatollah Khamenei, instantly mobilizes certain demographics, and the anger is immediately directed at U.S. diplomatic outposts. At the exact same time, you have the Pakistani military engaged in a violent, escalating border dispute with the Taliban government in Afghanistan over militant safe havens.
So everything boils over at once.
Right. When the geopolitical center of gravity in the Middle East fractures, the pressure radiates outward, and states that are already fragile experience cascading security failures. It's a domino effect. And those falling dominoes eventually crash straight into the global supply chain.
Which brings us to the economic chokehold. The chaos we're seeing on the ground and in the air instantly translates into terror on the oceans. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz, global oil flows, and India's baseline energy security. Because for you, the listener, this is the exact moment geopolitics directly impacts the inflation rate in your neighborhood.
Exactly. This is where it hits home.
India imports over 80% of its crude oil requirement, and a staggering volume of global oil and liquefied natural gas passes right through the Strait of Hormuz, which separates Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. Right now, that narrow waterway is essentially a war zone.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to understand the panic, you have to understand the geography of the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only about 2 miles wide in each direction.
2 miles? That's nothing.
It's a bottleneck. It is the absolute jugular vein of the global energy market, handling roughly 20% of the world's total global trade in oil. You cannot easily bypass it with pipelines. When that specific route is threatened with naval mines, drone swarms, or fast attack craft, the global supply chain goes into cardiac arrest.
And we are seeing that arrest right now.
The sources confirmed the immediate fallout. Qatari LNG production has been halted. Qatar accounts for about 20% of global LNG supply, which is the primary fuel keeping the lights on in both Asia and Europe. You combine that halt with the shutdown of Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery following the drone strikes, and you have an instantaneous, historic supply shock.
We've already seen Brent crude spike to roughly $80 a barrel, jumping over 7.5% in a single trading session.
It's a massive sudden jump.
I have to push back on India's readiness here, though. We constantly hear about strategic reserves and energy security planning. But the data in these reports suggests India is in a highly precarious position. They state India has only about 10 days of strategic oil reserves. Is that standard? Because 10 days sounds like a terrifyingly small buffer if a major global conflict shuts down the Gulf for months.
It is a terrifyingly small buffer, especially when you compare it to a nation like the United States, which, despite being a net exporter of energy, maintains a strategic petroleum reserve designed to last for months. Now, to be fair to the Indian context, the oil marketing companies, the refiners themselves, hold commercial inventory that provides an additional 60 days of cover. But you are absolutely right. In the grand scheme of a protracted global conflict, 70 total days of oil is not enough to insulate an economy of 1.4 billion people from a catastrophic price shock.
Why not just build more reserves?
Maintaining massive underground salt caverns filled with millions of barrels of crude is incredibly capital intensive. And historically, India has balanced the cost of building those reserves against the assumption that the sea lanes would remain open. That assumption just failed.
So what is the emergency playbook? When the assumptions fail, what do these refiners actually do on a Tuesday morning when the ships start moving?
They immediately scramble to find alternative sources of crude that completely bypass the Strait of Hormuz. They look to the spot markets in West Africa, they look to Oman, which has ports outside the strait, and they look across the Atlantic to the United States. And they look to secure Russian crude, which suddenly comes back into heavy focus despite the complex sanctions architecture simply because necessity dictates it.
Right. But securing new contracts takes time.
Exactly. For immediate relief, they engage in a practice the sources highlight, which is buying oil on water.
I wanted to ask about that. Oil on water is a fascinating industry term. It sounds almost poetic, but the context in the reporting paints a picture of absolute desperation in the commodities market.
It is pure desperation. Oil on water refers to crude oil that has already been extracted, loaded onto a massive supertanker, and is currently navigating the open ocean. But crucially, it hasn't yet been legally claimed by a final buyer at port. Or it's being held by a trader willing to redirect it for the right price.
So it's basically a floating auction.
Precisely. In a crisis, Indian refiners will rush to the spot market to bid on these floating cargoes. They will pay massive premiums just to guarantee that physical supply reaches their ports next week. It is a highly reactive, expensive measure because the alternative is a logistical nightmare.
Going the long way around.
Yeah. If ships cannot transit the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea, they are forced to reroute all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. According to an executive quoted in the reports, taking that extended route cuts the actual volume of Gulf supply reaching India down to just 1/4 of its normal capacity, while adding weeks to the transit time and burning millions of dollars in extra bunker fuel per voyage.
And when you add millions of dollars to the cost of importing energy, the financial markets react violently. Let's look at Dalal Street, because the numbers here represent a massive destruction of wealth. The domestic markets were severely rattled.
Rattles is putting it mildly.
True. The benchmark Sensex plunged over 3% intraday. That's more than 1,000 points, hitting its lowest level in 6 months. But the psychological milestone that really stings is that India officially lost its $5 trillion market cap tag. The total market capitalization slipped to $4.99 trillion for the first time in 10 months. You had foreign portfolio investors aggressively dumping equities.
And you cannot look at that stock market sell-off in isolation. It happened in tandem with severe currency depreciation. The Indian rupee hit a one-month low, settling at 91.48 to the dollar. That marks its steepest single-day decline in over 5 weeks.
Which just compounds the problem.
Right. What you are witnessing is a textbook macroeconomic flight to safety. When a geopolitical crisis of this magnitude erupts, global investors liquidate their holdings in emerging markets, which are viewed as higher risk, and park that capital in perceived safe havens, traditionally gold or U.S. Treasury bonds. But if you look beneath the headline index numbers, the sector-specific carnage tells a much more granular story about exactly how reliant the broader Indian economy is on cheap crude oil.
Right. It's not just the energy companies taking a hit. The sources outline heavy sell-offs in sectors you might not immediately associate with a war in the Middle East. Aviation stocks, for instance. IndiGo and SpiceJet were absolutely crushed, with IndiGo flighting almost 6%. Why do they fall so fast and so hard on this specific news?
It comes down to their fundamental operating models. For an airline like IndiGo, aviation turbine fuel jet fuel makes up roughly 30 to 45% of their total operating costs. Their profit margins are incredibly thin and highly sensitive to fuel price fluctuations.
Unless they've hedged the fuel prices.
Yes, but unless an airline has aggressively and perfectly hedged its fuel contracts months in advance, which is rare and expensive, a 7% spike in crude oil instantly obliterates their quarterly profit projections. Furthermore, they are now dealing with the logistical nightmare of vast airspace closures across the Middle East. If you are flying from Mumbai to London, you can no longer take the direct route over the Gulf.
You have to fly around the whole mess.
Exactly. You have to fly a longer, less efficient flight path, which means you are burning even more of that suddenly hyper-expensive fuel.
And it filters down even further. We saw massive drops in tire manufacturing stocks like JK Tire and Apollo Tires, as well as major paint companies like Asian Paints and Burger Paints.
Right, because what is a tire, fundamentally? What is industrial paint? They are essentially chemical derivatives of crude oil. The raw materials required to manufacture a tire or a bucket of paint are petroleum-based. Therefore, these companies' input costs are inextricably linked to the price of a barrel of oil.
So their costs just went through the roof.
Exactly. When oil spikes, their cost of goods sold skyrockets. You also saw engineering and construction giants like Larsen and Toubro declining more than 5%. L&T drives over 40% of its revenue from massive infrastructure projects in the Middle East. When the region goes to war, governments freeze capital expenditure, infrastructure projects grind to a halt, and L&T's future order books essentially evaporate overnight.
The fear is clearly palpable across the board. The sources noted that the India VIX, which acts as the stock market's fear index, measuring expected volatility, surged 25% to a 9-month peak.
That fear is rooted in a very unforgiving macroeconomic reality. When oil prices stay high, India's import bill inflates rapidly. The reports note that India's current account deficit has already widened to 1.3% of GDP in the third quarter due to a higher trade deficit.
Let's break down why that matters. The current account deficit is essentially the difference between the value of the goods and services India imports versus what it exports.
Right. Because India imports so much oil, a price spike means more U.S. dollars are flowing out of the country to pay for that oil than are coming in from exports. A widening deficit puts immense downward pressure on the rupee.
Making everything worse.
Yes. A weaker rupee then makes importing that oil even more expensive, which scares off more and partisan police. Foreign portfolio investors who pull their money out of Indian equities, creating a vicious, self-sustaining cycle of currency depreciation and market decline.
Which brings that high-level macroeconomic theory crashing down into the tangible, real economy. Because it isn't just numbers on a screen moving into the red. It's physical ships stranded at sea and supply chains physically breaking. The Indian government has had to activate a multi-ministry war room involving the Department of Commerce, the Directorate General of Foreign Trade, and the RBI.
They're trying to manage cargo congestion and figure out how exporters can even process payments when international banking channels in the Gulf freeze up.
The physical reality of this conflict is playing out on the decks of cargo ships. The Indian National Shipowners Association reported a genuinely harrowing statistic. 27 Indian-flagged vessels are currently stuck right in the middle of the conflict zone.
It's a terrifying situation for those crews.
These are massive merchant ships fully crewed by Indian seafarers, and the danger is absolutely not theoretical. The sources confirmed that an Indian mariner was tragically killed on a Marshall Islands-flagged crude tanker after it was struck by a bomb-carrying drone in the Gulf of Oman.
And the shipping industry was caught entirely off guard by that specific strike because the Gulf of Oman, sitting just outside the Strait of Hormuz, was previously considered a relatively safe haven-waiting area for vessels.
And this brings up a structural mechanism of global trade that most people never think about until it breaks. How do you even move a multi-million-dollar ship full of cargo when drones and missiles are active? The sources highlight that the hidden gear of global trade has completely jammed up, and that gear is marine insurance.
Yes, global shipping simply cannot function without marine insurance, period. You cannot get financing for a cargo, and you cannot get clearance to dock at a major port without comprehensive insurance. And the sources report that major reinsurers, the massive financial institutions that insure the insurance companies, including India's domestic reinsurer, GIC Re, have completely scrapped their marine hull war cover for the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and other high-risk zones.
So what does that actually mean for a shipping company? If GIC Re says we are pulling war cover, what is the immediate next step for a captain of an Indian-flagged vessel?
It means the vessel drops anchor and does not move. If a shipping company cannot insure its hull against acts of war, meaning if a missile hits the ship, the insurance won't pay for the loss of the vessel or the cargo. They cannot legally or financially risk sailing into those waters. It forces shipping to a total grinding standstill. They just can't risk it. The legal framework of global trade requires that risk be mitigated. For the very few operators who might try to risk alternative specialized insurance arrangements, the freight rates and the additional premiums demanded by underwriters are astronomical. We are talking about premiums surging by hundreds of % overnight, quoted on a strict voyage-by-voyage basis.
And that standstill at sea instantly hits local domestic industries across India. We're talking about the clothes in your closet and the tea in your pantry. The sources highlight Tirupur, which is a major knitwear and textile manufacturing hub in Tamil Nadu. West Asia is their third largest export market. They send roughly 11% of their total exports there. Right now, that cargo is just frozen.
It's not moving anywhere.
It is sitting in containers at domestic ports because buyers in the Gulf have instructed them not to ship. The tea industry is bracing for a virtually identical impact. About 41% of India's tea exports go to Gulf countries. Iran alone is a massive, critical buyer of orthodox tea.
This is a perfect, painful example of what supply chain experts call the bullwhip effect. A disruption at a shipping port in Gujarat doesn't just delay an order. The economic pain whips violently backward through the entire domestic supply chain.
Walk us through that.
Think about the mechanics. If a tea exporter in Kolkata or a textile manufacturer in Tirupur cannot physically ship their goods, their warehouses quickly fill to capacity. When the warehouses are full, they have to stop buying raw materials from local farmers and yarn spinners.
Because they have nowhere to put it.
Right. And because they aren't shipping, they aren't generating invoices, which means their cash flow completely dries up. For micro, small and medium enterprises or MSMEs, which operate on razor-thin margins and rely on continuous cash cycles, a few months of frozen cash flow can mean insolvency. They simply do not have the balance sheets to absorb massive spikes in logistics costs or prolonged delays in payment. It directly and immediately threatens domestic job security in these manufacturing hubs.
Which transitions us to the most critical, immediate aspect of this crisis, the human element, the diaspora, and the diplomacy. We talked about the seafarers stuck on ships, but the numbers for land-based Indian citizens in the region are staggering. There are 9 million non-resident Indians living in the affected Middle Eastern region, over 3.5 million in the UAE, nearly 2.5 million in Saudi Arabia, almost 1 million in Kuwait.
Evacuating even a fraction of that population in a contested environment is a logistical mountain that borders on the impossible. With airspace largely closed to commercial traffic and military operations ongoing, traditional air evacuation is severely constrained.
IndiGo did step up, though.
They did. The Civil Aviation Ministry announced that IndiGo is operating 10 relief flights from Jeddah, utilizing whatever narrow corridors are deemed safe. But for many citizens, the sky is simply not an option. The sources mention that some Indian nationals are having to resort to fleeing via land routes, attempting to drive across borders into Oman and Jordan just to exit the immediate hot zones and find a functioning international airport.
And while this frantic movement of people is happening, the diplomatic tightrope being walked in New Delhi is incredibly delicate. Prime Minister Narendra Modi immediately initiated calls with the leaders of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What stands out in the reporting is the strict, narrow focus of these calls.
Very narrow.
The Indian government has made it abundantly clear that their absolute priority is the safety of Indian civilians.
Yeah.
Modi officially thanked the leaders for ensuring the safety of Indians and condemned the violations of sovereignty, but the government is pointedly, purposefully avoiding taking a broader geopolitical stance on the specific military actions or assigning ultimate blame.
It is a highly calculated and necessary diplomatic silence regarding the broader conflict. India cannot afford to alienate any actor in this theater. But India isn't alone in this delicate maneuvering. What is highly notable in the diplomatic space is the strategic silence from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC.
The OIC's reaction, or lack of it, is really fascinating.
It is, despite the death of Iran's supreme leader, a monumental event in the Islamic world. Most of the 57-member OIC countries have refrained from issuing strong statements condemning the strike.
Why is that? You would assume an event of that magnitude would trigger universal condemnation from the OIC.
It highlights the deep, complex, and often adversarial political dynamics within the Middle East itself. The geopolitical reality is that several major Gulf states have spent decades locked in proxy conflicts with Iran over regional hegemony.
So they aren't exactly mourning.
While they must publicly maintain regional solidarity and express profound concern over instability, privately, some capitals may quietly welcome the weakening of Iranian influence and the disruption of its proxy networks. India is navigating a space where taking a strong, definitive geopolitical side could instantly jeopardize the safety of millions of its citizens living in Gulf nations that have incredibly complex, often contradictory relationships with Tehran.
And the stability of those millions of NRIs is intimately, directly tied to the stability of the Indian economy through remittances.
Absolutely. We cannot understate the structural importance of the remittance economy to India's GDP. West Asia is the largest source of remittances to India, second only to the United States. We are talking about billions of dollars flowing continuously directly into the bank accounts of families, primarily in states like Kerala, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Telangana.
And those jobs are vulnerable.
Extremely. Many of these workers are employed in low-skilled construction, retail, or hospitality job sectors that instantly freeze during a war. A sudden halt to their employment, or an inability to physically send money home due to frozen banking channels, translates to immediate, severe financial hardship for their dependent families in India. It is a vital economic lifeline, a massive source of foreign exchange that is currently in severe jeopardy.
The sources also point out that the geopolitical shock is causing deep domestic ripples within India's own borders. The Ministry of Home Affairs has had to ask state governments to closely monitor pro-Iran radical preachers to prevent any inflammatory statements from sparking local communal violence.
So we've seen it flare up.
We've already seen unrest materialize. At least 14 people were injured in protests in Jammu and Kashmir, which led authorities to shut down educational institutes and throttle mobile internet speeds as a precautionary measure to stop the spread of mobilization videos. It shows how instantly a drone strike in the Gulf can dictate the internet speed in a district in Kashmir.
It's all connected.
The chaos we are seeing in the Gulf underscores a massive overriding theme right now: supply chain vulnerability. Nations are suddenly, violently realizing they cannot rely on unstable regions or adversarial partners for their core economic survival. And that exact fear is driving quiet, rapid geopolitical realignments elsewhere. Which brings us to a very surprising visitor in New Delhi this week and a massive shift in relations between India and Canada.
Yes. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was just in New Delhi for a 4-day visit, holding extensive delegation-level talks with Prime Minister Modi. This is highly significant because over the last few years, India-Canada relations had experienced periods of severe, deep-freeze tension involving the expulsion of diplomats and halted trade talks.
It was pretty frosty there for a while.
It was. But now, according to the sources, we are seeing a definitive, aggressive pivot from mere normalization to a structured expansion of their bilateral partnership.
And they brought actual receipts to prove it. They sealed a massive $1.9 billion uranium deal. The Canadian company Cameco is going to supply India with 22 million pounds of uranium for nuclear energy generation between 2027 and 2035. They also finalized the terms to relaunch negotiations for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, essentially a free trade agreement, with the explicit, ambitious goal of rocketing bilateral trade up to $50 billion by 2030. They are cooperating on critical minerals, establishing a joint pulse protein center of excellence, and even reconstituting the India-Canada CEO Forum.
It's a massive turnaround.
I have to push back here, though. How did we go from expelling diplomats and freezing visas to trading thousands of tons of nuclear material so quickly?
You go from freezing visas to trading uranium quickly because the brutal realities of global economics override political friction. If we want to understand this sudden embrace, you have to look at what is happening south of Canada's border. Both India and Canada are feeling the immense crushing pressure of stiff tariffs and protectionist trade policies imposed by the U.S. administration under President Donald Trump.
So it's a reaction to U.S. policy.
Exactly. When your biggest, most vital trading partner, the United States, becomes highly protectionist and unpredictable, you are forced to rapidly, aggressively diversify your trade portfolios. Realpolitik demands it. The U.S. political landscape is essentially forcing India and Canada into each other's arms to secure their supply chains and find alternative export markets.
And the timing of the uranium deal specifically seems highly calculated.
It is perfectly timed. India just opened its nuclear energy sector to private participation 2 months ago, which is a massive structural shift. Historically, India's nuclear sector was entirely state-run and isolated. To attract this new private investment, India diluted its stringent civil nuclear liability rules, which had previously scared off foreign suppliers who feared being sued for billions in the event of an accident.
So it's safer for Canada to do business now.
Yes, Canada, which is a global powerhouse in uranium production, is stepping right into that newly opened, legally safer door. It's a marriage of India's desperate need for clean baseload power and Canada's need for massive non-U.S. export markets.
It's a fascinating example of how global pressures force local compromises. But speaking of how things are run internally, the sources also provided a rather sobering survey on India's own marquee PSUs, the top-tier public sector undertakings, specifically the Maharatnas and Navratnas. The government demands excellence from the private sector, but the numbers on their own corporate governance are, frankly, abysmal. In the financial year 2025, 36 of these massive state-backed companies lacked the minimum required number of independent directors. Even worse, 17 of them had absolutely zero women on their boards.
And this isn't just a bureaucratic oversight. It's a massive structural vulnerability. Why do we care about the exact makeup of a corporate board? Because corporate governance is the absolute bedrock of institutional investor trust.
Right.
The Companies Act of 2013 legally mandates a minimum number of independent directors and at least one woman director for listed companies. The goal is to ensure objective oversight, prevent conflicts of interest between the promoters and the shareholders, and protect minority investors from being steamrolled.
So when the government's own companies fail at this?
Exactly. When the government's own flagship companies, entities that control massive amounts of public wealth and operate in critical sectors like energy and infrastructure, fail to meet the very basic legal standards the government itself set, it sends a terrible signal. It suggests to global capital markets that these entities lack transparency, are susceptible to political interference, and have a high potential for mismanagement. Good governance isn't a regulatory box you check to appease activists. It directly dictates a company's market valuation, its cost of borrowing capital, and its long-term viability in a competitive market.
Moving from the failures of public sector governance to an active, intense fight in the private sector, there's a major battle brewing in the Indian auto industry. Major players, Tata Motors, Mahindra & Mahindra, and JSW-MG Motor India are actively, publicly opposing a new report from the Niti Aayog regarding the upcoming CAFE 3 norms. For those who aren't automotive engineers, CAFE stands for Corporate Average Fuel Efficiency.
The contention here is deeply technical, but it fundamentally dictates what kind of cars will be built in India over the next decade. CAFE norms don't mandate the fuel efficiency of a single specific car. They mandate the average fuel efficiency of a manufacturer's entire fleet of vehicles sold in a year. The automakers are arguing that the specific mathematical formula the Niti Aayog is recommending heavily disproportionately favors small cars.
Explain the math there. Why does the formula matter if the goal is just broadly reducing emissions and adopting EVs? The sources mention an EV adoption rate that is currently stuck in the slow lane, and that EV companies are scouting harder for lithium-ion cells. Shouldn't these norms just push everyone toward batteries?
You would think so, but it depends entirely on whether the formula is based on vehicle weight or vehicle footprint. If the fuel efficiency targets are designed in a way that strictly penalizes weight without accounting for utility, it inherently punishes companies that manufacture larger vehicles.
And batteries are heavy.
And here is the critical irony. Batteries are incredibly heavy. A large, family-sized electric SUV is massively heavier than a small, petrol-powered hatchback. These companies, like Tata and Mahindra, who specialize in larger SUVs, fear that the Niti Aayog's proposed norms will artificially skew the market back towards smaller internal combustion engine vehicles because they are lighter and easier to fit into the specific efficiency formula, thereby actually slowing down the broader adoption of larger EVs that the country ostensibly wants to promote. It's a classic high-stakes clash between rigid regulatory frameworks and the physical reality of corporate product strategies.
And speaking of shifting product strategies to meet market realities, the sources noted a quick hit regarding Mercedes-Benz. They are pivoting to local assembly in India for their V-Class luxury vans, which retail for around 1.4 crore rupees. By bringing the assembly locally, they can avoid the steep import duties slapped on fully built vehicles, lower the entry price slightly, and try to capture more of the high-end luxury transport market.
It's a smart, localized play.
We are also seeing a flurry of domestic corporate maneuvering in the background. Swiggy is pushing hard for profitability, but the sources note it is coming at the cost of their overall growth rate, highlighting the eternal struggle of the gig economy. In the media space, the massive Netflix bid is reportedly inflating Paramount's asking price for Warner Bros., showing how streaming wars are driving massive M&A activity. And in the FMCG sector, Dabur is expanding its footprint by buying a minority stake in RAS Beauty.
What you are seeing in all of those examples, Mercedes localizing, Swiggy focusing on margins, Dabur acquiring niche brands, is corporate India adapting to a highly volatile global environment by optimizing their domestic operations. When global supply chains are threatened, you secure your local market share.
That makes total sense.
And speaking of domestic stability, amidst all this global and corporate turbulence, there was one tiny, crucial sliver of financial stability for the everyday Indian worker. The government retained the Employees' Provident Fund, or EPF, interest rate at a solid 8.25% for the financial year 2026. In an era of rampant inflation and market crashes, maintaining that yield on retirement savings is a significant anchor for the middle class.
Finally, let's look at the future frontiers. Because while traditional industries are fighting over fuel norms and shipping lanes, the architecture of the next economy is being built. We are talking about artificial intelligence and space. The sources highlight that NVIDIA, the undisputed global king of AI hardware, is planning a massive $4 billion investment in two specific companies, Lumentum and Coherent Core. I have to ask, NVIDIA makes chips. Why are they dropping $4 billion on companies I've never heard of?
To understand this $4 billion bet, we have to look past the AI chatbots on our phones and look at the brutal physical plumbing of the internet. Lumentum and Coherent don't make software. They specialize in what are called optical interconnects.
Okay, optical interconnects. What does that actually do?
Here's the problem NVIDIA faces. When you are building a massive AI supercomputer, you are stringing together tens of thousands of individual graphics processing units, or GPUs. To train an AI model, massive, unimaginable amounts of data have to move between these processors. Historically, that data moved over copper wires using electricity.
Sure.
But copper has physical limits. It gets too hot, consumes massive amounts of power, and it simply isn't fast enough anymore. Optical interconnects solve this by using lasers. They convert the electronic data into pulses of light, transmitting it over fiber optic cables within the data center at the speed of light.
So it's basically upgrading the physical roads the data travels on.
Exactly. NVIDIA's investment proves a critical point. We are still in the very early foundational infrastructure building phase of the AI boom. NVIDIA isn't just satisfied building the chips. They realize they have to own and secure the hard physical technology required to link those chips together at an industrial scale, because bandwidth is the new ultimate bottleneck.
That's incredible. It's a reminder that the cloud is actually just millions of miles of physical cables and lasers. And speaking of hard physical infrastructure, we have to talk about NASA. The sources detail a massive historic rejig of the Artemis moon mission. NASA is officially delaying the Artemis III moon landing to 2028. But the delay isn't the real story. The real story is why. They are officially canceling their own space launch system, the incredibly expensive SLS rocket that has been in development for years, and fully pivoting to rely entirely on commercial partners, specifically SpaceX's Starship and Blue Origin.
This raises an important question about how we operate in space. This is a monumental shift. We are witnessing the definitive historical transition of space exploration from being a purely government-owned, government-operated endeavor to a privatized commercial service.
They're just outsourcing the moon.
Pretty much. For decades, NASA used a cost-plus contracting model. They would pay a traditional aerospace contractor to build a rocket, and NASA owned the rocket, absorbing all the massive cost overruns along the way. The SLS became financially unsustainable under that model. By pivoting entirely to fixed-price contracts with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, NASA is fundamentally transforming its identity. It is no longer a builder of rockets. It is now simply a buyer of delivery services. It is a fundamental rewiring of how humanity will access the cosmos, dictated by the ruthless efficiency of the private sector.
So what does this all mean? If we look at the incredible breadth of the sources we unpack today, the connections are truly staggering. We started with a geopolitical earthquake in the Middle East that instantly threatened global oil supplies, widened India's current account deficit, and literally froze shipments of tea in Kolkata and textiles in Tirupur. We saw how this chaos forced nations to reconsider their ultimate security, pushing France to boost its nuclear arsenal and pushing India and Canada to bypass U.S. tariffs and secure a massive uranium deal. And finally, we looked at how the future is being built not by governments alone, but by mega corporations investing billions in optical lasers for AI and private space companies taking over the mission to return humanity to the moon.
Today we saw how a single, violent, geopolitical spark can instantly freeze a tea shipment in Kolkata, ground a commercial airline in Delhi, and completely reshape France's nuclear deterrence policy. But as traditional state powers struggle to maintain order in the Gulf, and as we see governments willingly outsourcing everything from space travel to SpaceX to AI development to NVIDIA, are we entering an era where the resilience and logistical capability of private corporations will dictate global stability more than the treaties of nation-states? Next time you look up at the moon or next time you fill up your gas tank, ask yourself, who is really securing the supply chains of the future?
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. As always, keep asking questions, keep connecting the dots, and stay curious. We will see you next time.